everybody, today I am driving one of those cars that none of us really lust after. However, we all secretly know that it's probably a much better car than the one that we do. This is the BMW 550i. And if you're on the hunt for a used BMW, you need to know about CarVertical. Whether you're on the look for a 116i or a 760, CarVertical is a very clever and helpful service that cross-references a number of databases internationally to give you all the information you really need to know, including potential mileage issues, accident damage, regardless of whether a car has been written off, and other stuff, like whether it's been used as a taxi, any potential outstanding recalls, and even handy hints and tips on common model failure points. For the price of an incredibly disappointing Motorway Services burger, you can have all the peace of mind you want when buying your next car. For a special discount, check out my link in the description and comment section down below. Thanks to them for sponsoring today's video. There is no argument whatsoever that the E60 generation BMW M5 is a performance legend. A car that came from that wondrous era when more was more. Though the styling did receive criticism at the time, I think the car has actually aged very well, and there's no doubting the potency of that engine, either then or now. 500 horsepower courtesy of a naturally aspirated V10. Who wouldn't like the idea of that? Well, as it happens, quite a few people, because it became pretty well known that car did have a few issues. The engine itself was not immune to rod-bearing failure, much like the E90 generation M3, which shared much of its construction. The gearbox also was not particularly well loved, even when it worked. Those cars in Europe received exclusively a 7-speed SMG3 box, a single-clutch automated manual. At the time, very much in vogue, but now really quite old hat. Even worse, that gearbox also has its own reputation for fragility. It's known to break in a rather expensive fashion. Combine that with outrageous thirst, which was in the teens at best, and you had a car that for many was simply going to be too much of a risk. The cost to run versus cost to buy ratio was all out of whack, and that's a shame because it is a seriously cool car. I am constantly tempted by one as a daily, and though yeah, sure, I am used to that kind of fuel and running costs courtesy of the Ferraris, I don't really want a 15 grand BMW to cost me the same to run as a Ferrari. It's just very difficult to justify. So instead, what's the next best thing? Well, that's this, the 550i. Strictly speaking, of course, this is an E61, the touring version, which they also did for the M5, and that is about as cool a car as they come. I suppose you could say in some way they also did coupe and convertible versions, but those were badged as A6. I also have a particularly fond memory of that generation M5 because about 17 years ago now, myself and my friend Henry hopped over to Germany and back in a day to go and do the ring taxi, having been absolutely mesmerized with pictures of this legendary German track courtesy of Top Gear and Jeremy's exploits in a diesel Jag and latterly Sabine in a van. Not only did I get to experience a lap of the Nürburgring from the passenger seat of a V10 M5, but my pilot was none other than Sabine herself. It is for that reason and many others I've never felt a particularly burning desire to return, because in all honesty, how am I going to top that? Anyway, on to the car at hand. The E60 was a huge step forward for BMW in just about every area. Stylistically, a total departure from that which came before. Very much derided at the time, the new design by Chris Bangle was not well loved, but now I think it's actually a really handsome car. It has aged superbly. The interior was also a step change, whereas before you had a very traditional and Germanic layout with lots of straight lines and a center console that was gloriously angled towards you. Here, that was all thrown away, instead replaced with a series of swoops and curves that I think actually still looks pretty modern. We also saw, for the first time in a 5 Series, the introduction of iDrive, BMW's do-it-all, one controller for everything system, which again, at the time, people didn't like, but now you look at, and actually, it's kinda quaint. The E60 generation also saw the introduction of the mighty 535D, the twin-turbo-powered 3-litre diesel, which for me is the car that made diesels cool. That same school chump I took to the Nürburgring, Henry, well, his dad had a 535D, and he managed to achieve only about 24 to the gallon from it, which tells you how he drove it. That thing was seriously quick and made a real impression on me as a young man. Much of the front section of these cars was also constructed out of aluminium, helping to keep the weight relatively low. Even this more or less top specification 550i Touring weighs around 1800 kilos, so considerably less than, say, my Maserati Quattroporte, which was about 2 tons, and indeed less than many other equivalent cars. An MG ZTT with the V8 in, for example, is about 50 odd kilos less, but has an awful lot less technology and also a lot less power. Over the years, a number of other brilliant engines were also available with this car, including the M54 straight 6 as seen in the E46 3 Series and E39 5 Series. They were later replaced with the M52, one of my favourite BMW 6s, and the N53. You also had the mighty N54 twin turbo straight 6, which to some is the engine to have. Sat between those and the M5 was a couple of naturally aspirated V8s. Firstly, the 4.4 litre N62 badged the 545i, and then later in 2005 you saw the introduction of this, the 50i branded car with a 4.8 litre version of the same engine. Power is 360 horses and torque, conveniently, 360 pound-foot. What was perhaps of more interest to petrol heads was if you bought a 545 or 550, you had a choice of gearboxes, which in Europe we did not with the M5. So, the most popular by far was a traditional 6-speed torque converter ZF automatic, as we have here. But you could also have a manual, and if you were particularly strange, an SMG box as well. This is often forgotten. Even in the E46, when I had a 330, you could get those with an SMG, or a manual, or a torque converter auto. And while I understand people choosing an auto over a manual, I do struggle to wonder why you'd have the SMG. As far as I can see it, there isn't really any particular benefit. If somebody out there really has a thing for that gearbox or owns a car so equipped, I'd love to hear from you, because I just don't understand it. As you can probably tell, this car isn't entirely standard. It is in fact a Japanese import. This appears to be an increasingly popular trend, people importing European-built cars that were sent to Japan back to Europe. The main reason being, and the one that Ed cited, was that he finds cars from Japan do tend to be in better condition than those here, and you won't always pay a massive premium, but it will take just that little bit longer. Getting this car over took some 6 months. It has a full body kit and exhaust by a company called Energy Motorsport. We believe it may actually have been their demonstrator. It does look mean, this thing, although I have to say, I think the wheels are a touch too much. I love the style of them, but 19s on this is just a bit too big. As a result, the tyres are practically paper thin. 245 35s at the front and 275 30s at the rear. The car also sits on some lowering springs. We believe the dampers are as original. In truth, it's not anywhere near as horrific as I would have thought, but still, it's not the plush, comfy thing you may expect. The back boxes have also been changed out, and the car now has the quad tips you'd expect from an M over the dual tips you'd get from a regular 550. It is just a touch more vocal than a standard car, but really not at all raucous. I think it's actually really well judged. This is how these cars should have sounded from factory. One of my major complaints with my 645 was that it was the first V8 I'd owned, and a 4.4 litre BMW V8 at that. It should have sounded amazing, but instead I thought it sounded a bit like a diesel. That's just not right. To cruise around, as I am now, it's actually a rather wonderful thing. Visibility is generally pretty good. I love the panoramic roof, really does lighten the interior, and in fact, the whole thing still feels very high quality. Sure, now a little bit out of date, but classy nonetheless. You can also, if you so desire, add a little system up here that will give you Android Auto functionality, meaning this is still a car you could very much use day to day now. Even in drive mode without sport engaged for the gearbox, there is no other sport button in here, barring for the traction control. The car still has ample torque to pull you along at a very nice pace without any drama. These seats are very comfortable. They have oodles of adjustment, including in the side bolsters, which is really quite a nice touch. They're not active as they might be in an M5, but I think they suit this car very well. The only real shame for me of this is that it is a black on black example, which I know will appeal to some, but to me, the 5 Series has some much better options available to it that I think are just a touch classier, including some better leathers and various different materials for the interior. I do love the wood trim in here though, that is pretty nice. However, what's also impressing me is the steering in this car. It is hydraulic, not electric, and there does seem to be a bit of promise behind it. The suggestion that perhaps when you do want to have fun, this isn't going to be entirely unpleasant. So, I'm going to turn this car around. We're going to put it into sport, maybe even manual mode, though there are no paddles or anything up here for that. And we're going to see what it's like. Right, no two ways about it. That engine is absolutely brilliant. A real firecracker, revs up incredibly freely. And on a day like today where it's very damp and greasy out there, I've got the DTC enabled and it really is lighting up the rears at crikey, every available opportunity. It's like piloting a 140i, this thing. That rear is all over the shop. BMW, by this era, didn't really like fitting proper mechanical limited slip differentials to anything other than full-fat M cars, and this really does suffer because of that. I think it would be much better with one of those in it. Though the gearbox isn't the most responsive, I do appreciate the fact that to operate it manually, you pull it the correct direction, so towards you for up. And the fact is, with that engine being so responsive and having such a wide power band from sort of, well, it feels like 2 to 6.5, it isn't actually that much of a deal breaker. You get so used to driving modern turbocharged engines, and even some of the very best still have an air of lag about them. Here, no slack, nothing. It's brilliant. Let's try a basic overtake here. Don't need to rev the car out too much. Yep, there we go. Nice and easy. There's a bit of wind noise coming in from the panoramic roof, but road noise actually isn't all that bad. Cabin noise probably helped by these wind deflectors here. Oh, let's try this little section. Yeah, gearbox is so slow to change down. Oh, crikey, blimey. Yeah, these Toyo Proxes tyres are not the best, certainly not in these conditions. That's about the slipperiest and slidiest thing I've ever had a car on review. It's not particularly scary because it does rein it in, but still, that happened far sooner than it should have done. If this were the M5, you'd kind of expect, 500 horsepower is going to push a car around like that, but it's not. Pretty much the same capacity as an M5 though, and not actually that much down on torque, so probably explains it. Not scary that at all, it's just hilarious. And the steering, okay, the steering's not brilliant. It does have a nice bit of weight into it, it does feel reassuring, but when you go to press on, it doesn't really ever change. It's always the same. The ride quality actually is okay, though at a few moments I am pretty sure I've heard something metallic touch the ground, potentially the exhaust, and that's not so good. For a car like this, a touring, it should be a practical, usable thing. So for me, I would just stick the regular suspension on it or some regular BMW M Sport items and just put some proper tyres on it, some 18s, and get that sorted. And that, I think, would really, really fix this car. Mega practical too. Rear seat space isn't actually amazing, particularly if your drivers are on the tall side, but the boot is very good. You can easily take the family out. And indeed, one reason that Ed has acquired this car particularly is because he wants a dog. And the 7 Series and 5 Series E39 that he also imported from Japan are both saloons, so not really so suitable for Fido. So, how much are you going to pay to get your hands on one of these? Well, that's interesting. And I think one of the reasons the 550i is often overlooked, because the prices overlap with the M5 by quite a bit. A 545i would start at maybe about £6,000 to £8,000, and the 550i actually isn't that much more. In 2007, these cars were facelifted. This is an example of a pre-facelift. Though in the run-up to the facelift, they did also introduce a number of things like the keyless start here and so on, which means the difference to some may not really be significant. I would want to find a later example because it does have improved iDrive, slightly more modern looking headlights, all the usual BMW life cycle impulse stuff. But even one of those you can have for, say, around £10,000 to 12 maybe, and that's the issue. Because at about £13,000 to £15,000 for the particularly brave buyer, you'll start to see M5s. On both counts, a Touring will command a slight premium, a few £1,000s for the regular car and quite a few £1,000s for the M5. But it is impossibly cool, isn't it? You coming in? No? Okay, right. The car will change up for you even in manual mode, so not really much point using it. To be fair, for the odd blast, Auto Sport is actually pretty good. And like I said, this engine has a real nice spread of power, so it's actually not much of an issue. A really high-spec example, like this one with very low mileage, 35,000 here, and some nice toys like the body kit, the exhaust and so on, is going to command closer to about £20,000. And I know full well that for somebody like me, I'd have a really difficult time seeing past an M5. It's a whole lot more car for what I think is the same money. But it's not, though. It's going to cost you a fortune to run an M5. From that mid-teens MPG to the fact that if anything breaks and is M5 specific, it is going to cost you double or triple what a regular BMW part would be. For some, the insurance is also going to be an issue, though for me that's not actually a concern. The fact that you more or less have to get the rod bearings done, regardless of whether they're needed or not, is going to cost you at least a couple of £1,000s, and you're always going to be sat there wondering if something's going to go wrong with that gearbox, because if it does, not only will it be expensive, it may strand you too. It would be a more open and shut case for the 550 if it didn't have problems of its own. The E60 generally is quite a decent thing, but this engine in particular is a weak point. It's known to have issues with valve guides, the coolant hose that runs between the V, that's very expensive and a very common failure point, certainly at higher mileages, and it's known for various other leaks and issues too. Now in my 6 Series, I had no issues whatsoever, and I know many other people have had the same experience, but not all. And annoyingly, fixing some of those issues, particularly the coolant hose one, though there are some aftermarket solutions, I have found they don't always work that well, and that can be almost as expensive to fix as any of the issues you'd get with an M5. So for me, I'd wind up going straight back to the M and going, you know what, if I'm going to take a risk, let's do it properly and have a V10. And that's a shame, because actually, this is a great car. It's a lot of fun. It's a cool thing. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit out there, but at the same time, kind of safe, kind of practical, very much a usable car, particularly in touring form. I think it's a handsome devil, a really good looking car. You could certainly do a lot of miles in it, and really, the only criticism of this is the suspension, the fact it's a little bit too low and a little bit too firm, but that is easily solved, and not really the fault of BMW or the 550. Perhaps most importantly, despite the fact this is now a 15-year-old car, it moves like a modern one, I tell you. This is quick still. So then, if it were your money, what would you go for? The 545, or 550, maybe even a 6 Series? Or would you risk it and go for the M? Have you? How did it go? Please tell me. So then, that's enough from me. A huge thank you to Ed for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.